Here's something that should have been impossible. A Spanish chicken farmer with no military training convinced Nazi Germany that an entire American army was massing in southeast England, ready to invade France. Except that army didn't exist. The tanks were inflatable, the soldiers were actors, and the 27 spies feeding intelligence to Berlin? All imaginary. Juan Pujol Garcia sat in a London apartment inventing people who didn't exist, writing reports about troop movements that never happened, and somehow kept 150,000 German soldiers frozen in place, waiting for an invasion that would never come. And the moment that almost broke the whole operation, when he had to kill off one of his fake spies, and the Nazis sent condolences to the made-up widow. Juan Pujol Garcia wasn't a trained spy or a military strategist. He was a chicken farmer in Spain who'd watched his country tear itself apart in civil war and decided he hated fascists and communists with equal passion. But hating something isn't the same as being able to stop it. And Juan was just one person with no connections, no skills, and no obvious way to make a difference. So he did something that sounds completely insane. He walked into the German embassy and volunteered to spy for the Nazis. Not because he supported them, but because he needed them to trust him before he could destroy them. And the Germans, hungry for intelligence from neutral Spain, actually believed this random chicken farmer could infiltrate Britain and build a spy network from scratch. The year is 1941, and Juan approaches German intelligence with a story about his connections and his willingness to work against the Allies. The Germans train him in basic espionage, codes, invisible ink, how to write intelligence reports, and send him off to establish himself in Britain and start gathering information. Except Juan never actually goes to Britain. He stays in Lisbon, buys a guidebook to England, a map of the rail system, and starts sending fabricated reports to Berlin based on tourist information and newspaper articles. He invents an entire network of fictional sub-agents, a dock worker in Liverpool, a secretary with access to military files, even a Welsh nationalist angry about English oppression. Each imaginary person has a personality, a backstory, a reason for helping. The dock worker is motivated by money and resentment of British class structure. The secretary is having an affair with a military officer, and Pillow talks her way to classified information. The Welsh nationalist sees the war as an opportunity to strike back at English domination of Wales. None of these people exist, but Juan writes them so vividly that they feel real. And the Germans believe every word because the reports sound authentic, filled with the kind of specific details that only someone on the ground would know. Juan describes the weather in British cities, mentions local events he's read about in newspapers, references troop movements along railway lines that actually exist. The intelligence is detailed enough to seem legitimate, but vague enough that the Germans can't easily verify specific claims. Think about the audacity of this. Juan is sitting in Portugal, never having set foot in Britain, describing troop movements in cities he's never visited, naval activity in ports he can only imagine, military installations he's located using a tourist map. And it works because he understands something fundamental about deception. It's not about being perfect, it's about being believable. His reports include mistakes, small errors that make them seem authentic rather than fabricated. He describes soldiers drinking wine in Scottish pubs when they'd actually drink beer, but the Germans attribute it to confusion rather than fraud. The fictional sub-agents argue with each other, have personal problems, occasionally fail to deliver information, all the messy humanity that makes real spy networks dysfunctional. The dock worker complains about not being paid enough. The secretary worries her affair will be discovered. The Welsh nationalist goes silent for weeks because he's supposedly avoiding police attention. These aren't the clean, efficient operations of spy fiction. They're chaotic and imperfect, which is exactly what makes them convincing. But here's where it gets complicated. The British find out about Juan's deception, and instead of arresting him, they bring him to London and turn him into their weapon. British intelligence realizes they've stumbled onto something extraordinary. A man the Germans trust completely, who's willing to work against them, who's already established a fictional network that Berlin believes is real. So in 1942, they smuggle Juan into England, give him the codename Garbo for his acting abilities, and set him up as a double agent working for MI5. Now, Juan has to do something even more complicated than what he was doing in Lisbon. He has to maintain the fiction of 27 imaginary spies while actually being in the country they're supposedly spying on. He has to coordinate his fake reports with real British military activities so the Germans can verify some of his information, which builds trust, while feeding them false information about the things that actually matter. It's a constant balancing act. Be accurate enough to seem credible, be deceptive enough to actually matter. Here's what makes this so wild. Once Juan was in London working for British intelligence under the codename Garbo, his fake spy network became the foundation for the biggest military deception in history. The Allies were planning D-Day, and they needed the Germans looking the wrong way. So they didn't just let Juan keep sending fake reports, they built an entire phantom army to match his lies. Rubber tanks inflated in fields, fake radio chatter between non-existent units, all coordinated with Garbo's imaginary agents reporting on troop buildups that seemed real because the British made them look real, and the Germans had no idea they were basing their entire defensive strategy on information from people who didn't exist about an army that was made of canvas and air. They were moving real divisions, positioning actual tanks, allocating genuine resources to counter a threat that existed only in Juan's imagination and Britain's staging areas. German commanders were looking at maps, reading intelligence reports, making life and death decisions based on lies so elaborate they seem more credible than the truth. Operation Fortitude wasn't just about lying to the Germans. It required creating physical evidence convincing enough that reconnaissance flights and intelligence analysis would confirm what Garbo's network was reporting. The Allies assembled what became known as the First United States Army Group, or FUSAG, supposedly commanded by General Patton and massing in southeast England for an invasion at Pas-de-Calais. Except FUSAG didn't exist. The tanks were rubber and canvas, inflated like balloons, and positioned in fields where German planes could photograph them. The troops were actors and minimal support staff moving around to create the appearance of activity. Radio operators sent constant fake communications that German intelligence could intercept, discussing supply problems and training schedules and all the mundane details of a real army preparing for invasion. And every piece of this elaborate theatre was designed to support the lies that Garbo's imaginary spies were telling. Film studios like Shepperton were converted into war production facilities. But instead of building real weapons, they were constructing fake ones. Inflatable Sherman tanks that looked real from the air, dummy landing craft that appeared to be massing in harbours, entire fake encampments with laundry hanging on lines and mess tents that showed up perfectly in German reconnaissance photos. Garbo's sub-agents sent detailed reports about these build-ups. His fictional dock worker in Liverpool described seeing American troops embarking. His imaginary secretary reported overhearing plans for a Pas-de-Calais invasion. His made-up Welsh nationalist claimed to have infiltrated military planning sessions. Each report was carefully coordinated with the physical deceptions so that when German intelligence tried to verify the information, they found confirmation everywhere they looked. The dummy equipment, the radio traffic, the agent reports, everything pointed to the same conclusion. The main invasion would hit Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. German analysts would receive a report from Garbo about tank concentrations in a specific area, then reconnaissance flights would photograph those exact locations and confirm, yes, there are tanks there. Radio intercepts would reveal communications between units that Garbo's agents had reported seeing. Every piece of intelligence corroborated every other piece, creating a web of lies so internally consistent it seemed impossible that it could be false. What's brilliant about this is how it exploited the way intelligence analysis works. When you receive information from multiple independent sources that all confirm the same thing, you believe it. The Germans weren't stupid. They were being systematically fed a consistent false narrative from every angle. Garbo's spies reported troop buildups, and reconnaissance flights confirmed tanks in those locations. Radio intercepts revealed communications between FUSAG units, and agent reports described overhearing those same unit designations. The physical deceptions gave weight to the fictional intelligence, and the fictional intelligence explained what the physical deceptions meant. It was a closed loop of lies, each element reinforcing the others until the false reality became more convincing than the truth. And the psychological impact was exactly what the Allies needed. German commanders became so certain about Pas-de-Calais that when D-Day actually happened at Normandy, they convinced themselves it was the diversion for the real invasion that was still coming. Think about the resources devoted to this deception. Entire military units dedicated to creating and maintaining fake equipment. Radio operators spending months transmitting false communications. Artists and engineers designing inflatable tanks that would fool aerial reconnaissance. Film studio workers building dummy landing craft. All of this coordinated with one Spanish chicken farmer sitting in London, writing reports in the voice of 27 people who'd never existed, making sure every detail matched the elaborate fiction being constructed in the English countryside. But maintaining this massive deception required something nobody could fully control, making sure none of Garbo's 27 fictional spies made a mistake that would expose the entire operation. Imagine the psychological pressure on Juan. He's managing the fictional lives of 27 people, each with their own personality, their own access to information, their own reasons for helping the Germans. Every report has to be consistent with everything that came before. Every detail has to match the physical deceptions the Allies are creating. One wrong detail, one personality inconsistency, one impossible claim, and the entire house of cards collapses. And that's exactly what almost happened when one of his imaginary agents made a mistake that threatened to expose everything. The only solution? Kill the fictional spy and see if the Germans would believe it. There comes a moment in every deception where something goes wrong and you have to improvise. And for Garbo, that moment came when one of his fictional sub-agents reported information that didn't match what the Germans were seeing from other sources. The inconsistency was small but noticeable, the kind of discrepancy that makes intelligence analysts start asking questions. And once they start questioning one report, they begin reviewing everything, looking for patterns of unreliability. Garbo couldn't let that happen. So he made a decision that was either brilliant or insane. He would kill off the fictional agent, make it dramatic, make it emotional, make it so believable that the Germans would be too distracted by the human tragedy to scrutinize the intelligence failure. He sent a message explaining that the sub-agent had fallen ill, that his condition was deteriorating, and then, after a suitable interval, that he had died. And then Garbo did something that elevated the deception into something almost artistic. He sent a follow-up message from the agent's fictional widow. The widow's letter was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. It thanked Garbo for his friendship with her late husband, mentioned the financial struggles she now faced, and included small personal details about the funeral and her grief. There was nothing about espionage, nothing overtly manipulative, just grieving woman reaching out to someone who'd known her husband. The letter described how her husband had spoken fondly of Garbo, how he'd believed in the importance of their work, how his final days had been made easier by knowing he'd contributed something meaningful. And the Germans, reading this intercepted communication, responded exactly as Garbo hoped. They sent condolences. They expressed sympathy for the widow's situation. And then they did something that shocked even Garbo. They offered to provide a pension to support her during her bereavement. The enemy intelligence service that had trained Juan to deceive Britain was now offering financial support to a woman who had never existed, mourning a man who had never lived, because the emotional reality of the story overrode any suspicion about the intelligence inconsistency that had triggered the whole fabrication. This moment reveals something profound about the nature of deception and humanity during wartime. The Germans weren't monsters. They were people doing a job, people who could be moved by a story of loss and hardship, even when that story came from someone theoretically working for them against their enemies. Their offer of a pension wasn't strategic, it was compassionate. They weren't trying to manipulate the widow or secure her continued cooperation. They were responding to human suffering with human kindness. And that response, that genuine emotional reaction to a completely fabricated tragedy, shows how thin the line was between enemy and fellow human, how easily empathy could cross battle lines even in the middle of total war. For Garbo, it was a stunning success. The intelligence inconsistency was forgotten. The fictional agent's death explained away any future problems with his reporting, and the pension offer actually gave him a reason to mention the widow in future communications, adding another layer of authenticity to his network. But it was also deeply unsettling because it meant the people he was deceiving weren't the faceless evil he might have imagined. They were people capable of kindness, which made the deception feel more morally complicated. Juan was lying to people who were showing him compassion. He was manipulating the humanity of his enemies, using their capacity for empathy as a weapon against them. And while the strategic necessity was clear, this deception would save Allied lives, the emotional weight of it was crushing. Every kind gesture from the Germans made the betrayal feel more personal, more cruel, even though he knew the cause was just. But this moment of unexpected humanity was just a brief pause before the deception reached its ultimate test, D-Day itself, when everything Garbo had built would either save thousands of lives or collapse into disaster. Here's the thing about D-Day that most people don't fully understand. The invasion's success didn't just depend on the courage of soldiers hitting the beaches or the planning of Allied commanders. It depended on German forces staying frozen in place, convinced the real invasion was coming somewhere else. And that required Garbo to pull off the most dangerous part of his entire deception, convincing the Germans that Normandy was a diversion for the main attack at Pas-de-Calais, even after Allied troops were already landing. One wrong message, one moment where the Germans stopped believing him, and Patton's phantom army would evaporate, revealing the entire operation as fraud. Worse, if the Germans figured out they'd been systematically deceived, they'd rush every available division to Normandy and potentially push the invasion back into the sea. June 6, 1944. Allied forces hit the beaches at Normandy, and the immediate question for German commanders is whether this is the main invasion or a feint designed to pull forces away from the real target. Everything Garbo has built leads to this moment. He can't warn the Germans about Normandy ahead of time. That would save German lives and kill Allied soldiers. But he also can't stay silent, because that would make his entire network look incompetent or compromised. So he threads an impossible needle. He sends an urgent warning about Normandy that arrives just slightly too late to change anything, making his network look vigilant but not treasonous to the Allies. And then he follows up with the crucial deception: Normandy is the diversion. The real invasion is still coming at Pas-de-Calais, and Fusag is preparing to launch the knockout blow. The Germans receive Garbo's warning about Normandy hours after the invasion has already begun, which makes it look authentic without being actionable. Then his network floods Berlin with reports about Fusag preparing for the main invasion. His fictional agents describe seeing massive troop movements toward Pas-de-Calais, increased radio chatter, heightened security around embarkation points. The physical deceptions support every claim. Reconnaissance flights over southeast England show dummy armies that look like they're preparing to move. German intelligence intercepts radio traffic from Fusag units discussing invasion preparations. And crucially, General Patton, one of the most famous and feared Allied commanders, is visibly associated with Fusag, which makes the Germans believe this must be the real invasion force, because why would the Allies waste their best general on a diversion? So German high command makes a fatal decision. They keep 150,000 troops stationed at Pas-de-Calais, waiting for an invasion that will never come, while the Normandy beachhead expands and solidifies. Hitler himself is convinced that Normandy is the feint, that the real attack is coming at Calais, and he refuses to release the reserves that could have made a difference in the crucial first days of the invasion. Those 150,000 German troops sitting idle at Pas-de-Calais represent one of the most successful military deceptions in history. If even a fraction of those forces had been rushed to Normandy in the first crucial days, the invasion could have been pushed back into the sea. The Allies were vulnerable during the initial beachhead establishment. Supplies were limited, reinforcements were slow, defensive positions weren't yet secure. German counterattacks with fresh divisions could have been devastating. But those divisions never came because German commanders were convinced they needed to defend against Fusag's invasion. They believed it so completely that they kept forces at Pas-de-Calais for weeks after D-Day, even as the Normandy situation clearly wasn't a diversion. And the reason they believed it was because every piece of intelligence confirmed it. Garbo's network, reconnaissance photos, radio intercepts, all pointing to the same conclusion. The deception worked because it was comprehensive and consistent, because the physical and intelligence elements supported each other perfectly, and because Garbo had spent years building credibility that paid off in this single crucial moment. The human cost of that success is almost impossible to calculate. How many Allied soldiers lived because German reinforcements never arrived? How many families stayed intact because the deception held? Military historians estimate that the deception shortened the war in Europe by months, potentially saving hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. Every day the war continued meant more bombing raids, more civilian casualties, more soldiers dying in combat. By keeping German forces paralyzed at the wrong location, Garbo's lies created breathing room for the invasion to succeed, for the beachhead to expand, for the liberation of Europe to begin in earnest. But the strangest part of this entire story isn't the deception's success, it's what happened when the war ended and the truth finally came out. When Germany finally collapsed and Allied forces examined captured intelligence files, they found something remarkable. The Germans never fully figured out they'd been deceived. Even after the war, even after Normandy clearly succeeded and Pas-de-Calais was never invaded, German intelligence analysts still believed Fusag had been real. They thought maybe the invasion plans changed, or maybe they'd been called off due to Normandy's unexpected success. The idea that the entire army was fictional, that Garbo's 27 agents never existed, that they'd been systematically fooled for years, that truth was apparently too devastating to accept. And Garbo, he just vanished back into obscurity, his contribution classified for decades, his name unknown to the people whose lives he'd saved. After the war ended, Juan Pujol Garcia faced a problem that nobody had really planned for. What do you do with someone whose entire value was based on the enemy believing he was working for them? The Germans thought he was a hero who'd provided valuable intelligence throughout the war. The British knew he was a double agent who'd run the most successful deception operation in history, but publicly acknowledging either version of the truth would be dangerous. If the Germans knew they'd been fooled so completely, it would be humiliating. If the world knew how effective deception operations could be, it would make future operations harder. So the solution was to make Garbo disappear. Not literally, but effectively. Erase him from public record, classify his contributions, let him fade into the shadows while the official histories talked about tanks and generals and battles without mentioning the chicken farmer who'd made it all possible. Juan relocated to Venezuela, lived under an assumed name, worked ordinary jobs, and told almost nobody about what he'd done during the war. His contribution remained classified for decades. The full scope of Operation Fortitude and Garbo's role wasn't publicly revealed until the 1970s. Nearly 30 years after the war ended. By that point, most people had moved on. The veterans were aging, and the story of the Ghost Army was just one more fascinating footnote in a war full of incredible stories. Juan eventually received recognition from Britain. Medals, acknowledgement, historical documentation of his work. But that recognition came decades late, after years of anonymity, after a lifetime of carrying secrets he couldn't share. And the weird part is that even when the truth came out, many German veterans refused to believe it. They insisted Feuersag must have been real, that the deception story was itself a deception, because accepting the truth meant accepting they'd been fooled by imaginary people reporting on inflatable tanks. This resistance to believing the truth reveals something important about deception and human psychology. When you've built your understanding of events on certain foundational beliefs, having those beliefs revealed as false doesn't just change your understanding of that specific situation, it calls into question your entire judgment, your ability to analyze information, your fundamental competence. For German intelligence officers who trusted Garbo's network and used it to make strategic decisions, accepting that it was all fiction meant accepting they'd been catastrophically wrong about something central to their work. That's psychologically devastating. It's easier to believe the deception story is exaggerated or that there must have been some real elements mixed with the false ones than to fully accept you were completely fooled. And in a larger sense, the story of Garbo and Feuersag shows how World War II wasn't just about military might or industrial capacity or battlefield tactics. It was about information, belief, and the manipulation of reality itself. Juan didn't destroy tanks or kill soldiers or capture territory. He shaped what people believed, and those beliefs changed how they acted, and those actions determined who lived and who died. That's a different kind of power. Quieter and more subtle than bombs or bullets, but no less decisive. And the fact that his contribution remained hidden for so long shows how uncomfortable societies are with acknowledging that kind of power, how much we prefer clean narratives about valor and sacrifice over messy truths about lies and manipulation, even when those lies saved lives. The pension the Germans offered to the fictional widow was never collected, of course, because she didn't exist. But the offer itself remains one of the strangest artifacts of World War II. A gesture of compassion extended to a ghost, proof that even in the machinery of total war, human kindness could surface in unexpected places. The Germans who authorized that pension weren't calculating strategists in that moment. They were people responding to suffering, trying to do a decent thing in an indecent time. And maybe that's the real story Juan's deception reveals. Not just that lies can be powerful weapons, but that humanity persists even when we're trying to destroy each other. The same intelligence officers who were planning bombing raids and coordinating military operations took time to offer support to a grieving widow who'd never drawn breath. They were capable of both cruelty and compassion, often simultaneously, which is maybe the most human thing about them. Juan understood this intuitively. That's why his fictional characters worked so well. He wrote them as fully human, complete with flaws and struggles and emotional depth. He didn't create cardboard cutouts of spies, he created people, and the Germans responded to those people as people, with all the complexity that entails. What stories of hidden courage does your family carry? Share below and keep these voices alive.